They say the sword was French sharp, clean, merciful. But there was no mercy in the wind that morning, only the silence of a throat learning how to forget breath. She did not scream, not because she was brave, but because she was already gone. The screams had been buried long before beneath jeweled tapestries and beds that never bore sons, beneath the laughter of a king who grew bored of loyalty and the echo of a crown that no longer fit the shape of her skull. Anne Boleyn. They called her queen, witch, seductress, traitor, but names rot faster than bodies. What remained on the scaffold was not a woman, it was a question dressed in black velvet, trembling in the pale morning. The eyes that once held a court in their spell now flickered like candles in a crypt. Her lips moved, not to pray, but to remember, not to God, but to herself. They had stripped her of titles, robes, friends, and flesh, but not memory. And memory is the cruelest executioner. There is something obscene about a neck awaiting steel. It stretches, it hopes, it almost begs. But she did not beg. She only knelt, as though offering her throat were an act of defiance, as though death would be made smaller if she wore it like a jewel. And the king he did not watch. For even tyrants cannot bear the sound of justice misnamed. He rode away before the sword fell, as though galloping fast enough would erase the echo of her voice. The voice that once whispered in his ear and now drifted in the wind like smoke from a burnt offering. This is not a story of love, nor is it of war. It is a story of silence and what it costs to break it. She died, but something deeper cracked that day, a crown still bleeding, a womb still weeping, a throne still haunted. Let us begin with the eyes that watched her fall. She was not born to wear a crown, and perhaps that is why it clung to her like frost upon a rose, beautiful, biting, and quick to rot. Anne Boleyn had no lineage fit for the throne, no armies in her blood, no relics of destiny to cradle her name. Yet she moved through the court like a shadow wrapped in silk, her gaze sharper than daggers, her silence more violent than speech. The court of Henry VIII was not a place, but a fever, burning through flesh and loyalty with the same breath. And Anne did not enter it. She infected it. Her voice was music bent at the edge of temptation, her smile a confession drawn in lipstick. She wore French gowns like a second skin, each fold whispering rebellion, each pearl on her bodice a tooth pulled from the mouth of tradition. She was slender, but her presence swelled. Rooms twisted to hold her, hearts cracked to feed her. It was not beauty that crowned her, but the daring to seduce power itself. And Henry, swollen with hunger and haunted by sons that never breathed, looked upon her not as a queen, but as a cure. His first wife, Catherine, had grown old in her virtue and offered sin in bloom. The court trembled beneath her feet, half in reverence, half in hope that she might fall. They called her eyes demonic, her charm sorcery, her laughter the sound of scripture set on fire. But Anne believed in no witchcraft save the corruption of desire, and she used it like a chalice poisoned and glimmering. The walls of Whitehall dripped with envy, with tongues forked in prayer and betrayal. And still she danced through it, a woman unbending in a palace built to break. Yet even gods cannot stretch endlessly without tearing. The same eyes that had seduced the king now studied his every blink with dread. He no longer reached for her with fire, but with ice. No longer whispered her name in passion, but spoke it aloud in court with measured disdain. The scent of power, once clinging to her skin like jasmine, now turned sour. Something was decaying beneath her silks. The ladies at court, once pale and obedient, now curled like spiders at the edge of her throne, waiting for the fall. There was fear in every gesture, as though any gaze too long, any word too warm, might be interpreted as treason. Anne began to speak less, hold her breath longer, clutch her daughter closer. Elizabeth, red-haired and sharp as her mother's grief, was the only thing that had not turned against her. Even the walls now breathed differently, slower, as if listening. Each morning she dressed with elegance and paranoia. Each night she undressed with trembling hands and a heart heavy with invisible knives. The king had begun to vanish. Not in body, but in distance, his touch grew colder, his eyes searching for replacements before her scent had left his chamber. And yet, she refused to fade. She sharpened her words, adorned herself in steel-threaded silk, smiled with venom, and met courtly cruelty with unflinching poise. The chapel echoed with her footsteps, sharp, lonely, deliberate. God had been silent for too long, but Anne still knelt. She bled quietly each month, the empty cradle in her soul rattling like a ghost no priest dared exorcise. Her second miscarriage was whispered through the palace like the breaking of glass. Her third became a prophecy. The blood on her sheets was interpreted not as sorrow, but as evidence. She had failed the divine order. And in a world ruled by men who called their lust God's will, a woman who disappointed was not merely discarded, she was condemned. And so the queen became a storm waiting to be caged. Her brother George, her musician Mark Smeaton, her former lovers or imagined sins' names began to orbit her like vultures. Waiting, but that came later. In this moment, she still stood tall, ferocious, aching beneath the crown that cut into her scalp like penance. The air around her thickened with rumor. Even her smiles became dangerous. Courtiers no longer bowed with sincerity, but with suspicion. The feasts grew quieter, the letters from the king fewer, and in her chambers, Anne would trace her fingers over the embroidery of her gowns, as though remembering a version of herself that had not yet been consumed. She still wore her signature bee pendant, heavy and defiant, as if to remind the world she had not been swallowed yet. But power does not die with a scream. It dies with silence, one too many silences at dinner. One too many silences from the king. One too many silences from God. She knew it. She felt it in her bones when she lay down at night and the sheets felt too clean, too cold, too prepared. She felt it when her ladies-in-waiting avoided her eyes, when the wine was too bitter, when the priest no longer blessed her with conviction. The court was rotting from within. And Anne, once the flower that bloomed through stone, was becoming its sacrifice. They did not say it aloud, but the scent of death had returned to the halls, dressed in rosewater and betrayal. The courtiers began to speak in half-truths, their conversations carved with the care of executioners. And Anne, though not yet condemned, began to walk as if her body had already been measured by the block. There were no tears, no begging, only the eerie quiet of a woman too familiar with the taste of abandonment. Her daughter cooed in the cradle, and Anne would press her lips to Elizabeth's forehead with the reverence of one touching eternity, because in that child was all that would remain of her. A girl too small to wear a crown, too young to understand the slaughter of innocence, too divine to die. That night, Anne wrote a letter to the king, one last ghost stitched in ink. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not confess. She simply reminded him of what he had promised, of the fire in his words, the trembling in his hands, the son they never had. It was not a plea. It was a mirror. And Henry, bloated with guilt and lust and power, did not reply. Instead, he ordered his guards to ready the tower. And Anne, sensing the cold hand of fate gripping her throat, inhaled one final night of freedom. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply knelt before the wind and waited. The tower did not open its mouth to receive her with violence. It waited, still and ceremonial, like an old priest preparing to baptize a soul before extinguishing it. Anne walked between the stone jaws with a spine that refused to bend, though every echo of her footsteps summoned whispers from the shadow. There was no trial in her arrival, only ritual. The process of betrayal must be clean, must look holy, must feel inevitable. She was escorted not as a prisoner, but as a symbol, fragile, doomed, yet dangerous even in descent. Behind her, the air grew heavier, full of lies dressed in armor, of silence carved into court records, of names signed in ink and blood and terror. Her enemies did not rise from one place, but many, crawling out of the cracks in power's foundation. Thomas Cromwell, ever the architect of ruin, had sharpened the charges against her not with rage, but with patience. The same patience used to gut a deer without spilling unnecessary blood. He understood the need for spectacle, for language shaped like knives, for guilt that sounded inevitable, incest, adultery, witchcraft. These were not accusations. They were invocations, a spell cast to dissolve a woman's memory before her body turned cold. The men accused alongside her George Boleyn, her brother, Mark Smeaton, the musician whose melodies once lulled the court into breathlessness, Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, all drawn like flies into the amber of conspiracy. Some guilty only of existing in her orbit, others guilty only of not being able to escape it. Smeaton was the first to break, not with violence, but the threat of it. His confession carved into his throat like a brand. He admitted to laying with the Queen, though no soul present could tell whether it was fear or truth that birthed the words. George, her brother, was questioned with a fevered cruelty, asked whether his sister had lain with him as if such poison could be pulled from imagination alone. But the goal was never justice, it was removal. Anne's body was too powerful, too volatile, too drenched in memory to be left intact. And so the noose was woven from words, from glances, from the echo of her laughter in the wrong man's ears. Her downfall was not declared. It was whispered until it calcified. The court held its breath as Henry turned his face away from her, toward Jane Seymour, whose hands were as pale and empty as Anne's had once been burning and full. Seymour, the ghost of obedience, waited quietly at the edge of the king's desires, promising no arguments, no ambition, only sons. Anne's crime was never her womb. It was her will. She had danced where she should have wept, had spoken where she should have knelt, had ruled where she should have yielded. And now, that refusal became her sentence. The trial was a theater of rot. The charges were read not to be believed, but to be endured. Anne stood not as a queen, but as a riddle who dared defy the man who believed himself God. She did not cry. She did not faint. She smiled tight, strange, defiant, as if daring them to look into her eyes and see the truth behind the performance. They would not. They could not. To see her as innocent would be to indict the king himself, and no man born of ambition would choose truth over breath. The verdict was already engraved in stone. Condemned to death by sword, a foreign blade brought from Calais, a mercy only in appearance, for it suggested dignity even while robbing her of it. The court moved on quickly, like wolves brushing the blood from their snouts. But Anne remained inside the tower, untouched by time, visited only by her ghosts. She prayed not for salvation, but for silence. She braided her hair with fingers that trembled only when alone. She rehearsed her final words beneath her breath, knowing that any misstep would be recorded forever as her final sin. Outside, the scaffolding was being prepared, not merely as a place of execution, but as a stage upon which a nation would unsee a queen. The guards around her began to speak in shorter phrases, their eyes avoiding hers as if she carried contagion. The ladies assigned to her chamber wept in corners, unable to speak her name aloud. Anne walked in slow circles at night, whispering to herself, to Elizabeth, to God, to no one. The walls did not answer. She was no longer Anne Boleyn. She was the space between power and punishment, the echo of a desire that had dared to reach too high. Henry, meanwhile, was planning his wedding before her heart had stopped beating. He smiled again in public, rode out in hunts, celebrated the death of love as though it were a feast. His letters no longer mentioned her name. His eyes did not flinch when her brother was executed, nor when the others were drawn and quartered as if their bodies could confess what their mouths could not. George Boleyn died with a verse on his lips, Smeaton with horror in his eyes. The world around Anne dimmed not in mourning but in anticipation. The Queen was becoming history's ash before her blood had dried. And yet, within her, something refused to die. She spoke softly to the wind, remembering the days she had walked through palace halls like a storm. She touched her arms where once bracelets had glimmered, now bare, now colder than the stone beneath her feet. She dreamed of Elizabeth not as a child, but as a fire burning after her, unkillable. She imagined her daughter's hands wrapped around the same scepter that had marked her downfall, even in ruin. She dared to leave behind vengeance shaped as a girl. The guards came for her the night before the execution, not with cruelty, but with the quiet of men instructed to forget what they were doing. She nodded without words, stepped into the night air with the stillness of the condemned. Her breath hung in the darkness like a question without an answer, and still, she did not weep. The moon above watched in silence. The sword was already gleaming beneath its shroud. The world around her had chosen to forget she was ever queen. But Anne remembered, and in that remembering, she became something worse than dangerous. She became immortal. The sun rose as if morning were a weakness, casting no warmth upon the tower green where the scaffold stood like a throne inverted. Anne Boleyn awoke before the bells, before the crows, before the executioner finished sharpening the sword he had carried across the sea. Her breath was steady, not resigned but deliberate, as if each inhalation were a protest carved from silence. She dressed with precision, not vanity. Her gown was of deep gray, neither black for grief nor white for innocence, but the color of ash, of endings, of breath held too long. Around her, the women moved like shadows wrapped in fear. No one touched her without trembling. Her hair she arranged herself, careful and slow, fingers pausing at each braid as though tying knots into memory. She did not wear the bee necklace, not because she feared the letter, but because it belonged to the world that had already buried her name. As she stepped through the gates of her chamber for the last time, the air shifted not from wind, but from the gravity of finality. The soldiers who escorted her could not meet her eyes. They had seen many die, but few walked toward death with such terrifying calm. She passed windows that once watched her dance, hallways that had once hushed at her arrival, stone walls that now swallowed the sound of her shoes like a tomb already sealing. No one wept for her. No one stopped the march. The scaffold had been draped in cloth, not to honor her, but to keep the blood from spreading too far into memory. The executioner waited, faceless beneath his foreign hood, paid to bring mercy without delay. But Anne she delayed, not out of fear, but to save her. Her last gaze traced the sky, not in prayer, but defiance, as if daring heaven to look back. The crowd was gathered, not in reverence, but in hunger. They had come to witness the end of a queen, to see power made humble, ambition made headless. But what they saw was something stranger, dignity sharpened by despair, beauty rendered more haunting by how near it stood to oblivion. Anne spoke. Her voice did not waver. It rang like a bell through fog, measured, soft, final. She praised the king because death under tyranny must be polite. She forgave her enemies because to curse them would make her small. She asked for prayers not for her soul, but for the daughter she left behind. Elizabeth, a name she did not speak, but wore across her lips like an invisible wound. Then, She removed her headdress and tucked her hair beneath the linen cap, her neck exposed, pale as betrayal. She knelt upon the straw-covered platform. Her hands trembled only once. Not from fear, but from memory, the memory of a crown being placed, the memory of a child in her arms, the memory of a king once whispering eternity and now feeding her to time. She whispered to herself. Not a prayer, not a farewell, but something like a spell, words no one else heard, meant for no one else to keep. The executioner, trained in silence, lifted the sword not with cruelty but with speed, and still. Anne waited. Her lips moved, her shoulders squared, her eyes closed, not to hide, but to vanish. The blade struck, clean, swift, final. Her body fell forward in silence. Her head dropped with a grace that mocked the very concept of death. The crowd exhaled. The blood did not scream. It flowed, slow, dark, unapologetic. The queen was no more, but something lingered, a stillness so thick the air refused to move. The executioner stepped back. The guards covered the body. The onlookers dispersed, some with smirks, others with hollow eyes. The tower stood unchanged. And yet, nothing was the same. For Anne's death was not a conclusion. It was an opening, a fracture through which ghosts would climb. In the days that followed, Jane Seymour would be crowned, and the king would laugh again, feast again, try again for the son he believed Anne had denied him. But his eyes would never lose that flicker, that dull recognition of something undone. Elizabeth, the red-haired child once deemed a bastard, grew in the shadow of her mother's silence. No one spoke of Anne, not aloud, but the absence screamed louder than memory. In the corners of court, her name returned like fog untraceable, consuming. Every girl who dared raise her chin in court wore Anne's echo. Every advisor who whispered too near to power walked across the same invisible scaffold. Her ghost became political, not spiritual. She haunted not through visions, but through consequences. The very throne that broke her became the altar upon which her daughter would rise. And when Elizabeth claimed the crown, she did not weep for the mother they murdered. She became her in fire, in wit, in steel-veiled charm. The men who had silenced Anne found her reborn in a queen they could not dethrone. History tried to bury her beneath scandal, beneath shame, beneath false confessions, but bones cannot rot what breath remembers. And somewhere, in the cold hallways of the tower, the scent of rosewater still lingers. The stone bears no scar, but the air remembers. The silence remembers. The sword remembers. The queen who defied a tyrant, who ruled through desire and perished through decorum, left behind more than a corpse. She left behind the question, how many women must be sacrificed to decorate a man's divine illusion? Anne's death was never about guilt, it was about erasure. But erasure fails when legacy becomes contagion, and so her story slithers through the centuries. Not as tragedy, but as omen. She was not saint nor sinner. She was flame, and England burned too slow to feel it. Long after the king's bones turned to dust, her name still dances on tongues like wine that stings, like perfume laced with iron, like a wound that no crown can hide. And though the world may pretend to forget, the blood beneath the tower stones knows her. The wind that passes the chapel where she once prayed knows her. The daughter who became the sovereign the world could not silence knows her. And in that knowing, Anne Boleyn breathes. There is a hush that lives inside the tower still, not born from reverence, but from avoidance. They do not sing for her, they do not lay wreaths. But when the light strikes the scaffold stone just before dusk, there is a shadow that bends where no one stands. Some say it is the wind, others say it is nothing. But something remains unseen, unburied, unbroken. A woman who walked into her death with the silence of a queen and the fury of a prophecy. Anne Boleyn was not mourned the way kings are mourned. She was not entombed in gold, nor laid to rest beneath marble prayers. She was dropped into a box meant for strangers, her name removed, her body anonymous. And yet, history does not forget the taste of her defiance. It lingers like blood on the tongue, metallic and warm, refusing to fade. The men who condemned her did so to cleanse power of desire, but they failed. For desire cannot be killed with steel, it only transforms. And Anne, in her death, became more than flesh. She became the haunting, a presence without form, a whisper beneath the throne, a warning dressed in pearls and silence. No monument holds her truth, no scripture dares canonize her story. But she survives in the way tyrants flinch when women speak too clearly, in the way crowns tremble when daughters rise uninvited. She was not born to rule. She was not meant to last. And yet she does, in memory, in blood, in every woman who dares to outlive the men who write her ending. So let them forget her face. Let them erase her voice. It changes nothing, because somewhere in the marrow of power, Anne Boleyn still breathes, and the air, once so quick to betray her, cannot bear to forget.